Hello and welcome or welcome back to this channel. My name is Frida Bizel, and here I explore the Orthodox Jewish world, language, history, its relationship to Zionism, and so much more. As many of you know, my first language is Yiddish. It is the language of the Satmar Hasidic community that I come from. The story of why I grew up speaking Yiddish and not Hebrew is intimately tied to the story of the birth of Israel, Zionism, and Jewish languages. And so today I want to delve into the fascinating story of how two Jewish languages came to represent contrasting Jewish ideologies. I was inspired to do this segment after visiting the wonderful YIVO exhibit in Manhattan called Palestinian Yiddish, a look at Yiddish in the land of Israel before 1948, to which I will link in the video description. With me today is Eddie Portnoy, the curator of the exhibition. Eddie Portnoy is an expert on Jewish popular culture. Portnoy earned an MA in Yiddish Studies from Columbia University and a PhD in Jewish Studies from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. He currently holds the position of Senior Researcher and Exhibition Curator at YIVO. Welcome, Eddie.
Thank you, Frida. Thanks for having me.
Was that correct? Was that good?
Yeah.
Great.
Alles gesagt.
Alles gesagt. Wikipedia sometimes still delivered.
So actually, there used to be a lot of incorrect things in that entry.
You worked on it.
No. I don't even know how to get into Wiki. I can only read Wikipedia. I don't know how to change it.
Oh.
But someone at work made some changes.
That's very nice of them.
Actually inserted some jokes into it, which were eventually removed by someone else.
Oh, wow. That's hilarious. It's good to have a Wikipedia page then. The comedy.
I guess. Some guy in Poland made it. I don't even know how it appeared.
So on that note, I would love to get to know you a little bit, hear a little bit about your background. Who is Eddie Portnoy? Can we do a little bit of where you come from and your interests?
Sure. Wow, this could feasibly be a really long, boring story.
No, we can try to do it short. We can try to keep it an introduction.
Let's see. I'll just try to keep it to the topic at hand. So I grew up in Detroit. My father's first language was Yiddish, and he grew up in a household where Yiddish, was a house full of immigrants, and Yiddish was the language of the house, and it was the language he always spoke with his parents, and it was something that I took an interest in as a kid. And when I was around 13, 14 years old, I used to go to my grandparents' house, and I used to walk around with my grandmother asking what things were. I would say, what's this? What's this? I would point to things, and I would write them down in Yiddish. She would give me the Yiddish names for them. And so when I was in high school, my father bought me a little booklet called Der Jiddischlehrer, which means the Yiddish teacher. And I taught myself to read and write Yiddish. It was just this kind of weird hobby that I had. And so when, it was something that I maintained all through college. I never really took classes in it. I would, get books at bookstores, and I would just, read them. It was just something that interested me. And, a number of years later, after I went to college and I moved to New York, I got a job working for a small publishing company that was kind of academic adjacent. We used to do projects for a lot of academic libraries. And we did a project with YIVO, which I had never heard of. And YIVO is this kind of academic institution. It's sort of like a Library of Congress / Smithsonian Institution of the Jews, or of Yiddish culture and the Jews, or Jews of Eastern Europe. And so I hadn't heard of them because my grandparents, were from and weren't involved in Yiddish secular culture at all. And so they were my only entree into Yiddish culture. And so we did this project to microfilm old Yiddish newspapers with YIVO. And when I went to meet with the librarian to organize the project, I happened to tell him what I just told you about this hobby I had, where I taught myself to learn to read and write Yiddish. And he said, oh, well, YIVO runs this intensive Yiddish language summer program. It was, at the time, it was at Columbia University. Now it's in Bard College. And he said, you might be interested in that. So I looked into it, and I wound up taking it. I took a leave of absence from work. I took YIVO's summer program. I was able to go right into the advanced class because I already knew Yiddish reasonably well. And I was totally hooked. I was my mind was blown learning about, all of this Yiddish literature, the Yiddish press, Yiddish theater. There was this whole sort of universe of Yiddish culture that I just really didn't know about. And the next year I applied to grad school, wound up, as you said, getting a master's in Yiddish from Columbia, and then I wound up getting a PhD in history from the Jewish Theological Seminary. And I always tell people that I turned a fun hobby into a low-paying career.
There's not money in Yiddish.
I mean, no. The short answer is no. I mean, you can, do I make a living? Yes. But, I think I'm one of the few. I mean, they're, not, I will say that the trade-off for getting to work every day with something that I really love is totally worth it. It's like to get to work, like, so actually, the end of the story is, so I wound up, after I got my PhD, I taught at Rutgers for about 8 years. And then I wound up getting a job at YIVO, where I'm the academic advisor and curator of exhibitions, and I do a variety of other things with the programming and education departments as well. But I get to work with this incredible archive. So YIVO has this archive of something like 24 million documents and artifacts related to Ashkenazi culture. And it's not entirely Ashkenazi, but I would say 99% of it is. And it's everything from ethnographic collections, interviews, joke books, recordings, photographs, manuscripts of famous and not so famous Yiddish writers. There's a ton of Hebrew material. There's rabbinic material. There's an enormous amount of Holocaust-related material. It is really the greatest collection in the world of sort of Yiddish cultural material, only really rivaled by the National Library of Israel, which also has a fantastic collection. And YIVO was started now. One of the reasons that YIVO has this very significant collection is that it started in 1925. And that's when it started collecting. It was founded in 1925 and began collecting then. It was headquartered in Vilna. And so you could say it's a very Litvish organization. But it was headquartered in Vilna. It had offices in Warsaw, Berlin, and New York. When World War II broke out, the Berlin office had disappeared, by the time the Nazis had taken power in Germany. But when World War II broke out, the Warsaw office was shut down, leaving only New York and Vilna. Vilna at the time was under Soviet rule, so that lasted for about a year and a half until the Germans attacked the Soviet Union. And really, through the incredible efforts of a group of people who helped save a good portion of YIVO's archives during the war, does YIVO have portions of its pre-war archive. A huge component of YIVO's current archives is also material that they collected after World War II, once YIVO's headquarters, was moved to New York.
I want to start this discussion by giving a basic overview of what Yiddish, the language, is, and hopefully after that to talk about how it stands in contrast to modern Hebrew.
Sure. So Yiddish is a Jewish language that began to develop in, they think, the 9th or 10th centuries in the Rhine region of Germany. It's a Germanic language. It's a Jewish and Germanic language. Basically, the theory is that Jews from northern Italy and southern France began to migrate to the Rhine region of Germany, where they began to take on their own version of the local dialect. And so because Jews always lived separately from everyone else, any language they speak is going to be their own variant of it. So the Jews picked up this Germanic language, and when they wrote it using Hebrew characters. So when you look at a page of Yiddish, if you can't tell the difference between Yiddish and Hebrew, it just looks like Hebrew, because all the letters are, it's all in, in Hebrew letters. But there are various ways to tell the difference. Usually the Yiddish words are much longer than Hebrew words. That's one sort of quick and dirty way to figure that out. But there are other ways as well. Additionally, there's also a lot of Hebrew admixture in Yiddish. Just certain words and phrases in Yiddish are taken from Hebrew. A common one is the word for family, mishpuche, or mishpuche, which in the modern Hebrew is mishpacha. So, you have a lot of that as well. It's called the Lashon Kodesh component, or the holy tongue component of Yiddish. So as the Jewish populations grew in Central Europe, over the centuries, Yiddish grew with them. And as they were expelled from various places, as they moved to new places, in particular, they began to move eastward into the Kingdom of Poland. As a result of that, there was Slavic admixture, Polish and Slavic admixture that was included with Yiddish. Yiddish is a very flexible language. It's very absorbent. It easily accepts words and phrases from other language if there's a utility to it. Just as an example, a Yiddish speaker from Poland would have a lot of Polish words in their Yiddish. A Yiddish speaker from the United States or North America would have a lot of English words in their Yiddish. Yiddish speaker from Argentina might have a lot of Spanish in their Yiddish. So that's just the way that the language functions. It's just it easily absorbs, words and phrases from other languages. But over the centuries, as Jews moved into Eastern Europe, by the 18th century, they became the largest Jewish community in the world. And Yiddish was their language. And one interesting factor in this is that in the late 18th century, the Kingdom of Poland was split into three segments. It was the largest went to Russia, another portion went to Austria, or the Kingdom of Austria, and another portion went to Prussia. And when, as I said, the largest segment went to Russia, Russia, prior to taking over this area of the Kingdom of Poland, the Russian Empire didn't allow Jews into their country. But suddenly they had a lot of Jews, and they didn't really know what to do with them. So in order to handle what they perceived as a problem, they created what's called the Pale of Settlement, which is the area that basically conforms to the old Kingdom of Poland, but it was the area to which the empire's Jews were restricted. Sometimes certain Jews could get permission to enter the empire, but generally most Jews were restricted to the Pale of Settlement. And in the Pale of Settlement, there were other populations. There was a large Polish population. They were, in fact, the dominant population, but there were also Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Germans, a variety of different people. But Jewish interaction on a daily basis was mostly with Polish and Ukrainian peasants. And because and to a certain degree, Jews had to be able to communicate with these people. So they learned, whatever elements of their language they found necessary. But Jews didn't feel that the culture of Ukrainian and Polish peasants was sufficiently appealing to want to assimilate to it. And so they sort of turned inward and only spoke Yiddish amongst themselves. And so the Pale of Settlement became sort of this like Yiddish land area where Yiddish was really the dominant language of Jews. Now, if you compare that to what was happening in Germany, where German culture was a more modern, more advanced culture with growing art, music, science, philosophy that was really appealing to a lot of Jews. So the level of assimilation to German culture at the same time, and this is like late 18th, early 19th century, the appeal of German culture is really significant. So you have a lot of Jews just saying we'd prefer to speak German and just be Germans because it's so interesting. And as I said, the opposite is happening in the Pale of Settlement, where the other cultures don't really appeal to the Jews, and so they sort of turn inward on Yiddish. And during the 19th century, you wind up with a development of modern Yiddish literature, writers like Sholem Aleichem and Mendele Moicher Sforim, and a wide variety of others. You wind up with a Yiddish press, and at the same time, from the 1880s onward, you have a huge outmigration of Jews, because the reality was that life for the Jews in the Pale of Settlement was not particularly good. The economic situation was terrible. There were also occasional and sometimes frequent pogroms. They had no political or civil rights. They had to pay special taxes. It was generally not good. So if your position in society wasn't particularly strong, meaning you weren't in a good economic position, and the option to leave appeared, you left. And so as a result, from the 1880s through the 1920s, about 2 million Jews left the Pale of Settlement. These are Yiddish-speaking Jews, left the Pale of Settlement and went to places like, most of them went to North America, created large Yiddish-speaking settlement there. But also, Jews went everywhere. They went to Argentina was another locale, South Africa, other places in South America, Australia, and of course, Palestine, which Jews had been migrating to for 1,000 years in small numbers. But, by the 1880s, you have this interface between Jews and modern politics and nationalism. And you wind up with the development of a kind of proto-Zionism. And so Jews begin migrating in larger numbers to Palestine, where there was already a community of Jews that lived there. But what happened here is it increased the number of Yiddish-speaking Jews to a very significant degree.
Can you talk?
I could go on for a million years about this. Sorry.
I actually want you to expand before we talk about Hebrew, and I think this is relevant. If you can talk more about what you mean by the interface between, I think you said nationalism, modern, you were essentially talking about the beginning of these youth movements, these movements in the Jewish world, like I'm supposing Buddhism and so on. So can you talk about that?
Sure. So, beginning really in around the 1880s, you have, it's the age of industrialization, and it's the age of migration. And you also have, huge advancements in printing technologies and a variety of other technologies. But as far as printing technology goes, you wind up with Yiddish newspapers, and Yiddish newspapers becomes the delivery medium for not just news, but for political ideas and national ideas. And at the same time in Europe, you have other national groupings, who live in empires like the Russian Empire. So the Russian Empire is really a multicultural, multinational empire. And so you have, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Poles, Ukrainians, all kinds of different groups who want to gain their own national rights. They don't want to be ruled by, the Russian Tsar. They want to, they want their own countries. And often these places had once been kingdoms of their own. And this same thing happens all over Europe. You wind up with, you have, from the Age of Enlightenment on, you have the development of these states that were once kingdoms that become sort of national entities. And so this influences the Jews as well. But the Jews have this strange problem. Their place of national origin is not in Europe, and they're well aware of it. Not only
what do you mean their place? What do you mean by that?
Well, the Jews' place of national origin is the land of Israel, and and that's why Jews, consistently went back there. But they were made to understand, sort of most clearly through anti-Semitism, that they were not European. That Russians didn't consider them Russian, Poles didn't consider them Polish, and so on. There were certainly attempts, and sometimes successful attempts, to assimilate to these cultures, but invariably there were racists and bigots among them who refused the Jews, the possibility of truly being members of these societies. And so they were, the Jews were really these outsiders who wound up in Europe in a way a bit like Roma or gypsies. Their home, Roma's home, the homeland of the Roma is in India. And so, the Jews were made to understand this. And so this brought about the advent, because this occurred in the period where, nationalism and modern politics was becoming, part and parcel of everyday life and everyday thought. This is one of the things that prompted the development of Zionism as a modern political phenomenon. At the same time, you have phenomena like Bundism. So the Bund was an organization that was created. Actually, what's interesting is the first Zionist Congress was in 1897. The Bund was also founded in 1897, and the Bund was founded as the representative of the Jewish working class, and at the time, especially in the Russian Empire, left-wing politics was kind of the order of the day. There was really like a wide variety of them. There were Bolsheviks and Mensheviks and socialists of different kinds, anarchists. This is all very common. And one of the interesting aspects of all this is that Jews were allowed to participate in a lot of these movements, because these movements saw themselves as progressive and felt that, anyone should be able to, regardless of national origin, anyone could, be part of these parties. And so because Jews were welcomed in these parties, many of them joined. There was a lot of interest. In the beginning, at least, let's say the 1880s, 1890s, the reality was that they were kind of assimilationist parties. The Jews would end up having to speak the dominant language. Jews would have to speak Russian. They would have to speak Polish if they wanted to be part of these parties, because those were the dominant groups within the parties. But the Bund decided that that Jews were as a distinct grouping within society, that the Jews needed their own distinct representation. And that's why they were created. And interestingly, the initial founders of the Bund were not Yiddish speakers, but they learned Yiddish in order to be able to speak to the Jewish working class, whose language was Yiddish. And one interesting thing is that, the intention of the Bund was not to promote Yiddish or Yiddish culture when it first started. But what they eventually realized was that Yiddish-speaking Jews actually liked their culture. And so the Bund began to promote Yiddish as a sort of a cultural value unto itself. They developed Yiddish school systems, and had all kinds of lectures and publications and newspapers in Yiddish, and they became really one of the an important locus for the creation of Yiddish materials. Incidentally, these phenomena that I'm talking about, the sort of modernization of Jewish life and the entrance into the political sphere, also affected religious Jews who were at first sort of pushed it away. But in the early part of the 20th century, for example, when the Yiddish press becomes a significant force in Eastern Europe, Rabbonim realized that that religious Jews were reading secular newspapers, and they didn't want this to happen because there's material in secular newspapers that they don't want really from people reading. And so they gave permission for, I think it was in 1912, the Gerer Rebbe gave permission for the first Orthodox newspaper. And, from that point on, you wind up, and also 1912 it marks the creation of the Agudas Yisrael, the first Orthodox political party. And so that marks the entrance of, and it shows the influence on, this sort of new modern political world on, a variety of different Jewish communities.
How, though, largely did the religious Jewish community respond, besides for creating their own literature? What was their attitude towards these nationalistic movements, these new ways of Jews interpreting their play?
So certain groups were, for instance, when you have, the Bund is a socialist organization that is officially anti-religious. So that's obviously offensive to religious Jews. And so the Bund to them is an enemy. But as a result, one interesting thing is you wind up with, parties like Agudas Yisrael having offshoots created for working class religious Jews that promoted a form of socialism among religious Jews. So that's interesting in and of itself. Then you have Zionism, which was a problem for religious Jews of different types. So when the first Zionist Congress was announced, for example, in 1897, the first reaction was from, they're Haredi, but they're Orthodox Jews. But the first reaction was written by a group of Orthodox rabbis together with a group of Reform rabbis in Germany. So this is really weird because Orthodox and Reform hate each other as well. But Zionism was so offensive to these two groups at the time that they decided to, band together and comment on it. And so the reasons for their dislike of Zionism are totally different. So the Reform movement was opposed to Zionism because the Reform movement was ultimately an assimilationist movement. And according to Zionism, Jews are a distinct nation with a distinct homeland. And that made German Jews who were Reformed seem suspect in the eyes of other Germans, that they weren't truly German. They're something else. And that was an accusation that was always leveled at them. So that's why the Reform movement was opposed to Zionism. Orthodox Jews were opposed to Zionism because, according to tradition, you're not allowed to have a Jewish polity in the land of Israel until the Messiah arrives. And so without the Messiah, Jews cannot have their own country in Palestine or in the land of Israel. So, you have these two opposing forces, but then there's a third group which forms Mizrahi, the Orthodox political party. And Mizrahi, which in fact was a very, very popular party, my own grandparents were part of this party, they were a religious political party that promoted Zionism. And their view was that Zionism could help save Jews. Their view was that Jews in Europe were in danger and needed to go somewhere else. And that by creating a Jewish-run country in the land of Israel, they could help protect Jews. And that was basically the view of that religious party.
Go ahead.
Sorry, ask me anything.
Yeah.
Like I said, I'm going on all day.
Yes. It's a very big topic. But I do want to get to Yiddish in Palestine per se. So I want to talk about the birth of modern Hebrew in the context of all of this.
Right. So yes. So while this was all happening, this is like late 19th, early 20th century, with the advent of Zionism, you had people who wanted to recreate Hebrew as a modern language. Prior to that, it had been the language of prayer and study. And, certain aspects of daily life, like contract writing or letter writing, that's what Hebrew was used for. In order to do so, you had to be highly educated, which is why most Jews wrote in Yiddish, wrote and spoke in Yiddish. But there was a kind of, I would say, rabbinical and intellectual elite that had used Hebrew for centuries as not a spoken language, but a language of discourse, of a type of discourse. And so with the advent of these new political and national movements, there were Jews who wanted to, reestablish Hebrew as the spoken language of the Jews. And so they did. One name in particular is Eliezer ben Yehuda. He was, really one of the driving forces behind the recreation of Hebrew as a spoken language. And you even had schools. You had Zionist-run schools in Poland and Lithuania where this new modern Hebrew was the language of instruction. And this, starts in the early 20th century. And these are people who, live in Poland, let's say, and, Yiddish is their daily language. And, maybe they have to speak Polish, in the markets or elsewhere, but they're adding this sort of third language, this sort of ideologically provoked idea that, they may one day go to live in Palestine and they'll speak this language as their daily language. And that ultimately did come to pass.
Well, why wasn't Yiddish good enough for the Holy Land?
Part of, there's a component of Zionist ideology that was very much opposed to Golis or diaspora. In modern Hebrew, it's called galut. And in, I want to say around 1903, 1905, something like that, they developed a part of the ideology called Shlilat HaGalut, which means the negation of the diaspora. Zionist ideologues felt that the Jews' problems, their state of being oppressed in a wide variety of places, is a result of living in the diaspora, and only in the land of Israel, where they would speak their language of origin in their place of origin, could they be a complete people free of the issues that they faced in the diaspora. And so Yiddish, because it was the dominant language of the Jews at this time, something like 75 to 80% of the world's Jews speak Yiddish as their daily language. It is far and away the most dominant language among Jews. Yiddish was one seen as a threat to, the possible use of Hebrew in Palestine. And two, Yiddish was denigrated by these people as sort of the most symbolic language of diaspora Jewry. The idea that the hunched over, traditional Jew who's, works in the marketplace is weak, physically, this is a Yiddish speaker. And so the idea of Zionism was that they want to change, this version of Jewishness to create a new form, and kind of really create a new Jew that is strong, works the land, is involved in agriculture, has an attachment to the land, and speaks Hebrew instead of Yiddish, which, and Yiddish is not representative of any of this.
How was the dichotomy between anti-religious movement and Yiddish playing out in all of this, because we know there was a big Bundes, for instance, Yiddish culture. So what's happening with the religious Jews of Eastern Europe as Zionism and modern Hebrew is being developed?
So they're, I would say, not interested in it. They are opposed to Zionism. Officially, obviously, I've mentioned the Mizrahi Party, which promotes it and is, pure. It's a Zionist party. So there's that component of religious Jews. You have Hasidim, who are generally much more opposed to Zionism. Their view is that they're fine where they are as long as they can continue practicing their religion in the way that they want to, and speaking the language. Their language was Yiddish also. They didn't, promote it in the same way that the Bund promoted it, but Yiddish was always the language of instruction in, Hasidic schools and also in Litvish schools, in religious schools. This was the standard throughout Eastern Europe. And they say possession is 99 or not, 99% of the law. Because they're living their lives in Yiddish, their cultural lives, whether these people are religious or secular, is completely infused with the sort of Jewish culture that is embodied by Yiddish.
Yeah. So I suppose in a sense, we're saying that the Zionists had a very strong point about the power of the language.
Yeah. Well, look, language is the carrier of culture. The language determines very much, what culture you belong to. So if you, generally I would say that if you speak a Jewish language, that whole culture is embedded in that language. And it doesn't necessarily matter if it's Hebrew or Yiddish, but if you're in the diaspora and you speak a Jewish language, as opposed to, I don't know, French or English, your worldview, your cultural worldview is going to be different than someone who doesn't speak speak a Jewish language.
I am, to this day, I would say I am fascinated by the ability to revive Hebrew, to the miracle of getting a language to be spoken by an entire country. There was nothing like it in history, right?
No, it's amazing. It's amazing. And you have, it's interesting. There is a linguist by the name of Gilad Zuckerman, who's Israeli, but he teaches at a university in Australia, and he has been instrumental in reviving some Aboriginal languages in Australia. And his starting point is the revival of Hebrew, of modern Hebrew. And interestingly, this is just an aside, but his view is that modern Hebrew is actually very different from biblical Hebrew. And he doesn't even call it Hebrew. He calls what's spoken in Israel today, he calls it Israeli.
I see.
And one of the things that he notes is that a great deal of the Israeli language, as he calls it, is actually re-lexified Yiddish, meaning that many, many words and phrases are actually Yiddish words and phrases that were simply put into Hebrew and, became part of, the modern Hebrew language. But sort of the sub base of modern Hebrew is actually in some ways Yiddish.
It's interesting because, of course, the pronunciation is not Ashkenazi pronunciation, the pronunciation of
Right.
Hebrew. But that was also aspirational. They were trying to get away from Yiddish, but they were Yiddish speakers, right? The people who built Hebrew
Sure.
were Yiddish speakers.
Right. Well, that's one of the ironies of all of this is that, the people who were opposed to Yiddish were almost all Yiddish speakers. That was their mother tongue. That was the language they grew up speaking to their parents. And the language of instruction in their schools. And, when they played with their friends, they spoke Yiddish. And then, once, it's interesting to see how, an ideology can really change, someone's active daily life. You make this change and you go with it. And, people really on a large scale, swapped Yiddish for Hebrew. I mean, it's not an instantaneous thing. It took many decades, but it was clearly very successful.
By the way, speaking of calling Hebrew Israeli, I recently heard that there was an academic, I don't remember his name, I heard it in a dinner conversation, who published a book claiming that Yiddish should be called Weiberteig, or... Have you heard of that?
Really?
Yeah.
I have not heard that, but that is great.
You like that?
Wait, Yiddish should be called the Weiberteig.
Yeah. Or Teich, maybe Teich, which means translation.
Teich. Well, Yiddish, actually, Teich was always one of the names for Yiddish. Like Yiddish has, over the years, a variety of names, but Yiddish Teich, this was always a name for Yiddish. Jargon also was a name for Yiddish, jargon. This was, always, it was always a common name for Yiddish. But yeah, Teich was one of the normal. You could see this on books, from 17th and 18th century. That it's geschrieben in Teich. Like it'll say that on the cover of the book.
It's an impoverished name because it's just Teich literally means translation. So yeah, it's calling a language translation.
Right. Well, in the same way they called it jargon.
Right. Exactly. I've never heard that.
Yeah. I mean, Yiddish itself was, has long been a kind of oppressed and suppressed language. That it was, look, Hebrew is very much a prestige language. It's the language of liturgy. It's, that's, people are very attached to it in that way. Yiddish was the language of daily life. It's clearly not, it was never considered a prestige language. It was always, it was just, it had a utility.
Yeah.
It was useful. But it was the language of every day. It was a language of joking. It was a language of cooking. It was a language of singing. And it turned out that to a larger degree, Yiddish speakers really liked Yiddish. And, this is a common thing that I, heard throughout my childhood, that like, you can't say things in English like you can say them in Yiddish. Like my grandparents always said this. I mean, this is, sort of just an anecdote, but it's, but people feel very attached to the languages that they grew up in, that they had fun in, that their loved ones spoke. It's, it's meaningful in a variety of ways.
Yeah. And speaking of that, Yiddish was a language that was constantly at risk, or not constantly, at least without migration of Jews, there was this discussion about, is this the end of Yiddish,
Right. So Yiddish, people say that, I think that in the 1930s or 40s, Isaac Bashevis Singer, who's famous Nobel Prize winning Yiddish writer, said that, they say that Yiddish has been dying for 200 years. And I hope it keeps on dying for another 200 years. So yes, Yiddish is sort of like the ever-dying language.
So I actually grew up speaking Hasidic Yiddish. I'm sure that if we talked to each other in Yiddish, we would have a bit of a hard time because my accent's very different from yours. But one of the important things I grew up being taught was that Hebrew fat. You're not allowed to talk Hebrew. It's a Tumene Sprach. It's the unkosher or unholy language. And what was interesting about learning about Yiddish in Palestine was there was a bit of a reverse of that happening in pre-1948 Israel with regards to Yiddish.
Right. So, I mean, the story of Yiddish in pre-state Palestine is interesting, and is that, obviously that's the reason that I created this exhibit. And, one of the, just to go back a little bit further, one of the odd things that I found that I really didn't expect to find was how far back Yiddish went in history. And so like my, when I first got the idea to do it, I thought, the Hasidim came to Palestine in the sort of, early mid 19th century. They were followed by Litvaks. And so like they were probably, they sort of made up the bulk of the old Yishuv during the 19th century. They were probably the ones who brought Yiddish to Palestine. And so then I was looking at a website called the Princeton Geniza Project. And this is a website that catalogs and has a database of a huge number of the fragments in the Cairo Geniza, which is really an incredible collection of all kinds of written material that was found in a Geniza, or a sort of storeroom in a synagogue in Cairo. And there are something like 400,000 total fragments, and they comprise, songs, stories, religious documents, letters, all kinds, business contracts, shopping lists, all kinds of things that related to daily life among the Jews, mostly the Jews of Cairo. But there's a lot of correspondence from Jews around the area. And in the collection of the Cairo Geniza, there is a packet of stories called the Cambridge Codex, because it's in the Cambridge University Library, that was found in the Cairo Geniza, and is dated to the 1380s. So 1380, that's a long time ago. That's not something that you and especially you wouldn't expect to find a collection of Yiddish stories in the Cairo Geniza at all, much less from the 1380s. So that's kind of amazing in and of itself. And I'm sure that it didn't get there in 1380, but probably hundreds of years later. Nonetheless, there's also a collection of 5 letters written in Yiddish from a woman in Jerusalem by the name of Rochel Zussman to her son Moshe in Cairo. They were written during the late 1560s, which is also really early to consider the idea that there are Yiddish speakers in Jerusalem. It's not something that people think about a lot. And certainly there weren't a lot of Yiddish speakers at the time there, but they had a large enough community. And, one of the aspects, when I said before that Yiddish isn't a prestige language, things at this time, in the 16th, 17th century, they're not, things that people write down are getting thrown away. People don't save letters in Yiddish. It's not something like, it wasn't like someone would save a letter in Hebrew because it's deemed as, more valuable or more important. But a letter in Yiddish was, and even like stories in Yiddish, these are things that just got thrown away or, read to bits. So these things all disappeared. So this is kind of a really valuable find. These 5 letters from the 1560s written in Jerusalem, and sent to Cairo. They're letters from a mother to a son, and I have some reproductions of them in the exhibit itself. But because they're letters from a mother to a son, the bulk of the content is like, please come back to Jerusalem. There's nothing for you in Cairo. There's work for you here. Please come back to your family, this kind of stuff. But also, you don't write me enough letters. Yeah. I will punish you before you die.
Oh, no.
She's like this Yiddish mama that
she's guilt tripping him a little.
Right, she's totally guilt tripping him, which is really kind of amazing to see in a letter from the 1560s, written in Yiddish. But I guess that's the Yiddish mama is a type that is immutable and will never disappear. So that was interesting to find in and of itself. And there's not much evidence to mark the existence of how many people spoke Yiddish in Palestine during the 19th century. I think in the the 1840s or 50s, a book is published called I think it's Iti Makorot that mentions the different languages. It's written by a rabbi in Poland who takes a trip to the land of Israel, and he in the book he notes what the different languages that are spoken in Jerusalem. And one of the things he mentions, I think, is that the Ashkenazi community has a really hard time communicating with everybody else because they only speak their language,
and everyone else spoke white.
I guess. Oh, so there are 3 main distinct communities in Palestine at the time. And this is, let's say, early mid 19th century. You have I guess you could call them the Mizrahi community. And they're the community of Jews who have lived there since the fall of since the destruction of the Second Temple. They've been there for, almost 2,000 years. And then you have the Sephardi community, most of whom arrived at the end of the 15th century, after the Jews were expelled from Spain and Portugal. So those two groups both speak Arabic as their everyday language. The Sephardim also speak Ladino, which is kind of like the Spanish variant of Yiddish. As one of their daily language.
Yeah, which is mostly disappearing. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, there are far, far fewer speakers of Ladino today than than there have been, and I think comparisons are often made with Yiddish, but I think it's not a particularly good comparison to make because the Yiddish-speaking population was always much, much larger. Although, during the late 19th and first half, let's say, of the 20th century, there's a fairly significant Ladino press. There were Ladino newspapers in New York. In Istanbul was a center for Ladino. There are other locales as well. So it became a modern language in similar ways to the Yiddish did. It never had, Yiddish newspapers in the 1920s had readerships of up to 1 million people a day. Ladino never had that. There's no Ladino theater. I mean, people perform in Ladino, but Yiddish theater was
a thing.
Yeah, I mean, there were once 12 Yiddish theaters on 2nd Avenue, within like 10 blocks of each other. It was a true mass culture. Ladino had that just on a much, much smaller scale.
So back to the languages people were speaking in Israel, pre-Israel, and Ashkenazi Jews having difficulty.
Right. So Arabic is Arab. It's you're in Ottoman-ruled Palestine. The majority of the population is Arabic speakers. As a result, Arabic is the dominant language. So if you need to be able to function in society, you need to be able to speak Arabic. And so this becomes apparent when, one interesting aspect of all this is in the beginning of the 1880s, you wind up with this kind of proto-Zionism and Jews emigrating from Eastern Europe to Palestine. They wind up getting folded in. They create what's called the new Yishuv, as opposed to the old Yishuv, which is, made up of these three communities that I just mentioned. The new Yishuv is sort of modern, politically engaged Jews mostly from Eastern Europe who are driven to speak Hebrew, as their language. They're mostly interested in engaging in agriculture. And so while some of them do settle in Yerushalayim and the new people in the New Yishuv don't go to Tzfat. Tzfat was a center for especially Hasidim. But the Jews of the New Yishuv, these sort of proto-Zionist and Zionist Jews, want to settle the land. They want to engage in agriculture. And one of the reasons they want to engage in agriculture is one of the accusations always leveled against Jews in Europe was that the Jews aren't a real people because they don't have land. They don't work the land, so they're not authentic. And so as a reaction to this accusation, Zionists were like, we need to work the land. And what's more, we need to work our own land, in the land of Israel. And so agriculture was a really important component of these early settlements. And in fact, one of the earliest Yiddish publications that appeared in Jerusalem in 1893 was a booklet all about agriculture. It's a booklet in Yiddish about, how to plant crops, what to plant, how to keep insects off of them. It's very sort of, it has a utility, but this is one of the earlier Yiddish publications that appeared in in Jerusalem in the 19th century.
What else is there? I know there was an Yiddish, how to learn Arabic.
Right. So yes. So Arabic was so important just to get around and do things that there were multiple booklets published in Yiddish for Yiddish speakers on how to learn Arabic. In Yiddish, you call them Lernbüchler. But they're like these little booklets that that teach you kind of the basics of reading and writing and speaking Arabic. And they were published all over the world. And because Jews were always interested in with the advent of Zionism, this place became a more and more important locale for emigration. And so one early one we have in the exhibit was published in New York, I think in 1917 or 18. Then there's one that was published in the mid-1920s in Warsaw. And you also have them published in Tel Aviv as well. Until Hebrew became, the dominant language, Arabic was really a necessity. Some of this, actually, one interesting side note is that many Jews who lived in Eastern Europe were bilingual anyways.
They spoke let's say Polish and Yiddish and
yeah. Right. I mean, like I said before, language has a certain utility. If you need to get something done, buy something in the marketplace, take a class, I don't know, anything, you may need to learn another language. And this was just a necessity of life in a region that was itself multilingual. And so, Jews often knew more than one language. And once you know more than one language, it's often very easy to learn yet another.
You think? I know 2 languages. I don't find it to be the case.
I mean, I don't know, it depends. I mean, it depends whether or not you yes, people like to learn languages as hobbies, but let's say, I don't know, I sent you to France and you had to get around. Obviously English has become a dominant, an international language. But let's say actually, France is a bad example. Let's say I sent you to some small town in China.
Okay.
Where no one speaks English. Right. You would have to learn Chinese to figure out how to live.
Yeah.
And so when you're forced into it, what choice do you have? You just do it. It's like, immigrants do this all over the world. They go to work, sometimes they've never even been to school. I mean, I can think of my own grandparents. They never went to school, but they learned English. They learned, whatever they needed to in order to, live their lives. And it's just, that's, why language is just, it becomes this important utility that if you don't learn it, you're missing out on a lot of opportunities.
So what happened back in Palestine? What happened?
So what happens in Palestine is you have this huge influx beginning in the 1880s. You have this huge influx of Jews from Eastern Europe, and they're all Yiddish speakers, and they're all Zionists. But you have this element of Zionism that I talked about earlier, Shlilat HaGalut, the negation of the diaspora, the anti-Yiddish attitude. So by the first decade of the 20th century, the Zionist movement is developing practices to get people to stop speaking Yiddish. So just as an example, an informal rule existed saying that if you had been in the country for more than 2 years, you could not speak in a public forum in a language other than Hebrew.
Really?
Yeah. And so that meant that if you were like a union meeting and you wanted to ask a question or make a statement, it had to be in Hebrew. If you had been in the country for more than 2 years, it had to be in Hebrew. This also plays out in the press. So one example is in 1907, this group called Linke Polizien, or the Left Labor Zionists, who interestingly were a Zionist group. They were a socialist Zionist group that had no problems with Yiddish because they felt that Yiddish was the language of the Jewish working class they were a representative of the Jewish working class, and they had to be able to speak to their constituents in their own language. Additionally, they wanted to be able to communicate with Jews outside of Palestine, most of whom spoke Yiddish. So it made sense to them that, they should use Yiddish as a language of discourse. So in 1907 in Jerusalem, they published this magazine called Der Anfang, which means the beginning. And it's basically a little magazine all about socialism and the need to institute socialism among the working classes of Palestine. A couple months later, another socialist Zionist group called Hapoel HaTzair, or the Young Worker, begins to publish their own magazine, which contains a lot of the same material about the need to implement socialism. But in Hapoel HaTzair, almost every issue has attacks on the use of the Yiddish language. And they're these really virulent attacks, saying, and actually one interesting thing is they won't call it Yiddish. They call it either jargon or hasafa meduberet, the spoken language. And so
why won't they call it Yiddish?
Because they don't want to give it
the credibility,
credit
I
of
see.
Being like a real language. It's like Iran won't call Israel Israel. They call it the Zionist entity. It's the same phenomenon. Like it's like if you call it by its real name, you're giving it some sort of credibility that you don't think it deserves.
Yeah, there's the power of word.
Right. So so this sort of marks the beginning of this kind of language war. And as part of this, you have all kinds of different incidents, like some Yiddish writers come to Palestine to give lectures in Yiddish on literature in 1914, and they're protested, by sort of fanatic groups of Hebrew speakers, and all of this, like the fanaticism of Hebrew, the Hebrew language fanaticism is inculcated in students in schools in Palestine. And this is like a new Zionist school system where the language of instruction is in Hebrew, and they are also instructing the students in Zionist ideology. And part of this ideology is to oppose Yiddish and oppose diaspora culture and to build your own new culture, in the land of Israel. This has already been inculcated in these students, and so they're the ones who go to protest these writers. A little bit later, in 1922, a group is created called, an organization is created called Gdud Miginei HaSafa, which is usually translated as the Battalion of Hebrew Language Defenders. And it is a group of fanatical Hebraists who, promote Hebrew language culture and defend it against, those who don't speak Hebrew. So interestingly, the group was initially created because they discovered that the Technion, which was the scientific university in Haifa, certain classes were being taught in German. And they were being taught in German because the professors were German emigres, and also the best textbooks were written in German, sometimes by these very professors. So it made sense that the language of instruction in these courses would be in German. So this was too much for the Gdud Miginei HaSafa, and they, protested, these classes that were being taught in German. The reality is that they didn't have any success in stopping it because it had like a real utility. It made sense to do it. About 5 years later, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, which had been founded 2 years previous in 1925. So in 1927, the Hebrew University proposes the creation of a Yiddish department at the university, which makes sense because Yiddish is far and away the dominant language of the Jews in this period. There is more Yiddish literature than any other Jewish literature. Yiddish theater, it's a gigantic mass culture. So it makes sense to, have a department of Yiddish at Hebrew University. So the Gdud Miginei HaSafa is furious about this, and they begin very adamant protests against the creation of this department. And they actually succeeded in preventing it, which, shows sort of their growing power. Now, so at the same time that all of this sort of like anti-Yiddish activity is occurring in this place, you have a group of Yiddish writers who love Yiddish and want to write in Yiddish. And so during this time, they are writing books, they're writing Yiddish literary anthologies that get published from, around the 1920s through the 1940s. And they produce this really interesting Yiddish literature that is based in Palestine. It's got these stories from kibbutzim.
Which are,
it's got stories
can you translate
about
kibbutzim?
Oh, sure. Kibbutzim are Jewish communal farms, which is like a unique feature of the new Yishuv in Palestine. But it's got these stories about in Yiddish about kibbutzim, stories in Yiddish about Bedouins, who are nomadic people in the area who are not Jewish. But it creates this sort of new Yiddish literature that's really interesting. But the Gedud B'nei Safa and, sort of many Zionists are opposed to the use of Yiddish. And so there is a Yiddish literary union that has meetings every once in a while. And so the Gedud B'nei Safa would find out where these meetings were, and they would do things like cut the electricity of the building they were in, or they would smash the windows. Sometimes they would accost the members of the Yiddish Literary Union in the street and beat them up. Yeah, it was like a literal language war. It was crazy. And the crazy irony of all this is that all of these people were Zionists, all of these people were socialists, all of these people spoke Yiddish, and all of them spoke Hebrew as well. And there's this one issue that's setting off this group that they cannot live with. And so they fight. And that's, to a certain degree, that's what, when you're very attached to an ideology, you'll kind of do anything. And so that's what they do. It's really it's an interesting sort of footnote in the history of, Zionism and the Jews of that, era and place.
Yeah.
And so that's really why we did the exhibit, because it's just, people aren't familiar with this. And it's just a sort of fascinating moment in the history of this place.
Yeah. It's now Passover. This is going to be published after Passover, but it's not Passover. I've been discussing with friends that the interpretation of the miracle of Passover that some of us are familiar with is that the reason that God took the Jews out of slavery, out of Egypt, was because of Shaim Lushna Malbish, because the Jews did not change their names, their language, and their clothing. They kept it Yiddish with Streimler.
Right. So Sam Sofer said the same thing. And he used this exact language. Like Sam Sofer said, you should never change your names, you should never change your language, and you should never change your style of clothing.
Which is interesting.
And so that's what, that's more, even more so. That's why contemporary Chassidim continue to speak Yiddish, continue to, obviously they never change their names, but also continue to wear, their distinct type of clothing.
Yeah.
That's absolutely true.
And
this creates a barrier around, around the rest of society.
I think often in dialogue about societies, we lose sight of the tremendous power of the language that is spoken in a society. And that
language is enormously powerful.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So anything else about Israel Yiddish before I ask you a final question?
Sure. I mean, the one thing I can add is there was this one really interesting figure, a man by the name of Mordechai Kosover, who was born in Vilna and emigrated to Palestine at about the age of 20 or so. He was a student. He was really interested in Yiddish, in the Yiddish language. And he, in the 1920s, he did the first and kind of only study of the Yiddish of the Jews of the old Yishuv. He went to places like Mea Shorim and Sfas, where there were, many, many Jews of the old Yishuv who spoke the Yiddish of the old Yishuv. And he did a study of their language. And one of the things that he discovered was that there was a huge amount of Arabic admixture in their language. So, when we started and I talked about how, Yiddish is this language that easily absorbs words and phrases from other languages, just as the Yiddish of, the United States has a lot of English in it, the Yiddish of Palestine, from the time it started, always had a lot of Arabic in it because Arabic was the dominant language. And so he did the study and published a book called Arabic Elements in Palestinian Yiddish. And that's actually where the exhibit got its name from, Palestinian Yiddish.
I see.
And it's got hundreds and hundreds of examples of the way that Arabic words function within Yiddish. And it's really, and that's also part of the exhibit. It's really kind of a fascinating work that this man did. And we're really fortunate that he did it, because otherwise we would never have known.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I did look at it, and I don't think I knew a single word that we saw in the exhibit that were Arabic.
Oh, in the examples,
Yeah, the examples,
that I gave. Well, so the one example that most people are familiar with, like do you speak Hebrew?
A little bit.
A little bit. Okay, so there's an expression in Hebrew, ala kefa.
Yeah.
Means like that's great.
Yeah.
And that's from Arabic. That's not Hebrew. It's an Arabic expression. So in Kosovar's examples, that's one of the ones that he gives. The example that he gives, "Sizgor ala kefa." It's really like, it's like saying like it's really awesome. It's really great.
Yeah.
So that's that's just one example of like many of how how that kind of language functions within Yiddish.
I did grow up with the word yalla.
Oh yeah, right. Of course, that's everywhere.
Yeah. But it was,
sure.
we thought it was Hebrew, and it was a bad word, but we still said it.
That's funny.
Yeah. So
That's
my
funny.
final question, and thank you so much. I've learned so much, but it's something that's been on my mind because I see you on Twitter and you're tuned into what's happening in the world right now. Is it okay that I say that?
I mean, I'm as tuned in as any like elderly Jew is tuned into anything.
Well, what my question was going to be, because the exhibit, I'm sure you've been working on for quite a long time, and then it was on display after October 7, when there's been so much dialogue about the history of Israel. I'm wondering
Right.
if you've seen in some way the context of current events colliding with the exhibit.
A little bit. When I first opened the exhibit in last September, we got some complaints that it was an anti-Zionist exhibit.
Really?
Which
it's
it's
not.
not. Yeah. Right. Of course it's not. It's critical, I would say, of a certain aspect of Zionism, this phenomenon of shlilat hagalut, negation of the diaspora. And, like the fact that I say in the exhibit that, early Zionists persecuted Yiddish is a true statement. I'm a historian. I can't, not say that. That's just the reality. That doesn't make it anti-Zionist, but that was one of the initial reactions that we got. After October 7th, I don't know. People, I think, were a little bit maybe reticent to want to criticize aspects of Zionism. At least some people were. Actually, some people were really happy to criticize aspects of Zionism after October 7th. But I didn't see that much, because the event was so, enormous and horrible. I don't think people really looked at the exhibit and said, this has anything to do with this. I mean, it's just, this is a historical exhibit. It's about matters that are, long over. It doesn't have anything to do with what's going on right now.
I guess the place my question is coming from is there seems to be a lot of need for education about the history of Israel prior to its formation.
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of need for education, period. I mean, I think a lot of people don't know anything, which is obviously a problem.
Yeah, but they're not going to come to an exhibit on Yiddish in Palestine as their starting place for learning.
I mean, you know what? Well, you know what's weird is sometimes people just wander into this building and just want to look at exhibits. And to me, that's
Yeah,
really
that's
cool
lovely.
because they're falling into something that they didn't expect to fall into, and they're learning something about it. And to a certain degree, I'm thrilled that that happens, because if I can teach something, something about anything to someone accidentally, in a way that's really an easy way to learn. When you don't expect something and it's interesting and it's compelling and you didn't expect it. That really helps, push knowledge along.
It's a wonderful exhibit with wonderful manuscripts and stuff to look at.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for coming to see it.
Yeah. Well, hopefully others will come. Till when is it running?
It's up, I think, I want to say to the end, I think just for like another month, I think.
So on that note, I want to wrap up by asking you to tell me what you would like for people to know about the work, or where they should go. Anything you publish that you'd like people to know of, or so on. Website.
Wow. I don't know. I mean, obviously, come to YIVO for our public programs and exhibits and things that we do. It's a really amazing organization. And if you're doing research into the Jews of Eastern Europe in any way, it's one of the best places in the world to come and do research. It's really a fantastic organization. Other things I wrote a book about 5 years ago called Bad Rabbi and Other Strange But True Stories from the Yiddish Press, which is full of literally strange but true stories from the Yiddish press. That's really like unusual stories about Jews, mostly in Warsaw, New York, but it's sort of the moment where Jews are becoming modern, and it's sort of their clash with modernity, where they're, where scandals, the scandals of their personal lives begin to meet the front pages of Yiddish newspapers. And so there are just a lot of stories about, I guess, bad Jews, like, Jewish criminals, Jews rather, not necessarily bad Jews, but some are bad. But, Jews who got caught in compromising positions.
I see.
Let's say.
Salacious stuff.
Right. It's not it's not like any other Jewish history.
I see. I hear you. Sounds fun. Thank you so much for your time. And I want to thank everyone for watching. For those of you on the podcast, for listening. I'll be linking to Eddie Portnoy's stuff in the video description. And thanks again.